John's flashlight being cut through the oppressive heat of the Malaysian night. The mud flat beneath his boots was slick and thick, sucking at his feet with every heavy step. He was with a group of locals from the village near the Sarawak River, men whose faces were etched with fear and desperation. They were shining their own lights further up the bank, into a tangle of massive mangrove roots. One of the older men, Silas, pointed with a trembling hand and whispered for John to look. In the harsh, cold glare of the lights, a grotesque shape shifted. A fisherman's casting net, a jailer, was snagged deeply in the roots. It should have been empty, having been lost days ago. Instead, it was bulging, the thick twine stretched to the breaking point. Within the mesh, something massive was trapped. It was a ular sawa, a reticulated python. The snake was impossibly large, its body as thick as John's thigh, caked in river mud and struggling silently against the tight netting. Its head was hidden, lost in the coils and the roots, but its massive bulk heaved. The crowd breathed a collective, ragged breath of horror. That snake was huge, heavy enough to weigh down the net. Was that what the searchers had felt earlier? Was that the powerful, thrashing presence they thought was their missing man? Silas shook his head, but his expression was shadowed. They were looking for David, a local man who had vanished without a trace, and this just made everything feel more impossible. John's breath caught in his throat as the snake gave one final, desperate twist, and the mud beneath it seemed to shift. John wasn't from this village, but he had a connection to it, and he couldn't stand by while the family suffered. The story of David's disappearance had reached him even in the city. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to find the source of the dread that now hung over the entire community like the dense river fog. He started his quest at the heart of the community, the Surau Bandarsa, a traditional wooden prayer hall. The air inside was humid and thick, smelling of old, polished wood and incense. He sat on the floor with Silas, the same elderly man who had pointed out the snake, now acting as his guide. Silas didn't just tell a ghost story, he shared local history. He described the missing man, David. He wasn't a mental case like some outsiders might dismissively claim. Silas painted a picture of a simple, incredibly sensitive man. David, he said, often seemed overwhelmed, as if the waking world with all its noise was too much for him to handle. He would flinch at loud sounds, retreat into himself, and spend hours just staring at the river, listening to something nobody else could hear. Following the elder's directions, John walked deep into the village. This wasn't the modern, bustling Kuching across the river, this was old, traditional territory. He navigated a network of narrow, shadowed lanes, the lorong of KPG number 2. The wooden houses leaned in closely on both sides, their eaves nearly touching overhead, creating a cool, shadowy tunnel even at high noon. John felt the containment. The path was dirt and gravel, worn smooth by generations of feet. This, Silas had said, was the last place David was seen. He had walked into these tight corridors that only ever seemed to lead deeper into the village. The houses themselves seemed to whisper, their walls holding the secrets of everyone who passed. Silas had described it as if the alleys themselves had swallowed the quiet, sensitive man, leading him toward the one final, immutable destination that every path in this neighborhood eventually found. John kept walking. The maze of alleys eventually began to open up, the dense, humid air of the village giving way to the fresh, slightly silty smell of the water. He reached the end of the final, dead-end lorong. The narrow wooden walkway terminated abruptly at a small, weathered wooden dock. The view that greeted him was vast and imposing. The mighty Sungai Sarawak stretched out before him, a wide, slow, silty brown ribbon that was the lifeblood of this region. Across the water, the modern Kuching skyline provided a stark contrast. The Astana and the spectacular new DUN building stood bright against the sky. But here, at the river's edge, it felt wild and ancient. The current was powerful and deceptively calm, a silent force that could pull you under without a sound. This was where the search parties had first gathered. This was where the local fishermen, the people who knew every curve of the bank, had concentrated their efforts. They were practical men, focused on the physical, but even they spoke with hushed tones about the pull of this specific spot. John stepped off the dock and onto the bank, navigating the mud flats and the tangle of mangrove roots. Retracing the specific search area Silas had mentioned, he found a reminder of that terrifying first night. The fisherman's casting net, the heavy, circular jala, was still snagged in the roots, though now partially submerged by the high tide. It was a stark, brutal image. The python was still there, now dead, its body bloated and heavy within the net. John felt a cold shiver run through him as he looked closer. Even in death, the snake was terrifying. Silas had described the confusion of that first night of searching. They had thought the heavy weight they were hauling was David. The net had been heavy, resisting, thrashing against the water, just as they would expect a man to. But when they brought their lights to bear, they had found this monster, itself a powerful predator trapped by a simple net. The constrictor's scales, thick and mud-caked, now seemed to represent the dense, impenetrable barrier of the mystery they were facing. As the investigation continued, the sense of hopelessness only grew. The snake was a terrifying discovery, yes, but it wasn't David. The search continued, but the river was massive and the mud flats were dense with roots. The community was growing weary, and more importantly, they were growing afraid. The fact that a massive python had been caught in the exact spot they were searching was too much of a coincidence for the superstitious villagers. They whispered about Hantu air, water spirits, about the Orang Minyak, oily man, about ancient forces that guarded this specific turn of the river. They feared that something spiritual, something outside their understanding, was intentionally hiding David's location, perhaps using the python as a diversion or a guardian. Desperate, Silas, acting now not just as an elder but as a spiritual leader, decided they must fight fire with fire. As dusk gathered on the bank, the community assembled, the fear palpable. They requested that the Azan, the holy call to prayer, be performed right there, on the muddy, contested ground of the riverbank. The twilight sky was a dramatic and terrifying mixture of fiery orange, royal purple, and deep, shadowy blue, its reflection churning on the silty water. John watched as Silas, standing only feet from where the python was trapped, raised his hands to his ears. Silas, his voice strained but powerful, performed the Azan, facing the river itself. The holy words rolled over the water, seemingly swallowed by the vast, open space in the distant, modern city. The crowd stood in absolute, silent reverence, praying that this sacred call would lift the veil and reveal what was hidden. It was a moment of profound spiritual vulnerability and intense community faith. The Azan concluded, and the silence that followed was heavy and expectant. The sun had finally dipped, and the tide was beginning to recede, pulling back from the mud flats and the mangrove roots. Moments later, one of the fishermen cried out. They hurried down the bank, flashlights converging. In the exact same tangle of roots and mud where the python had been trapped, where they had looked a dozen times before, the receding tide and perhaps the lifting of the supernatural veil had finally revealed what was hidden. David was there. His body was pale and still, resting peacefully on the soft mud near the roots that had concealed him. He was wearing the same simple, tattered striped shirt that Silas had described. The community gathered in a solemn circle, their flashlights shining down on the body, illuminating the face of the man they had sought so desperately. It was not a scene of terror, but of profound sadness. David's expression was gentle and calm, as if he had finally found the peace that had always eluded him in the noise of the living world. The massive, dead python still lay trapped in a net only feet away, a powerful, dark sentinel that had been revealed alongside the quiet man. The quest was over. John sat on the steps of Silas's modest, traditional wooden stilt house in KPG, number 2. He had collected all the details. He had listened to the local history, navigated the alleys, witnessed the clash of nature and spirit. John was holding a small, aged, laminated photograph that David's family had given him. It was a simple portrait, perhaps the only one that existed, of David. He was a gentle-looking man, smiling shyly at the camera, wearing an old-fashioned striped shirt. He looked like the kind of man who would spend hours staring at a river, listening to the secrets it carried. John looked down at the picture. He had honored the memory of the lost man. He had documented the struggle and the final piece they had found. The river fog was thick this morning, obscuring the far bank, blurring the lines between the modern city and the ancient village, between life and death. The Sarawak River flowed silently on, carrying its secrets, its predators, and its quiet souls, forever.